Hello and welcome to Nebula Talks. Before we begin, we have a few updates and reminders for you. We would love to have you be part of our Nebula community. And you can do so by logging on to www.nebula.com, where you can join communities related to your area of interest, register for upcoming Nebula Talks, book one-to-one skylifts, and view other upcoming events. You can also take this opportunity to connect with fellow learners or the speaker by sending a connection request. When you connect with the speaker, you will be able to contact them directly as well as receive updates about their upcoming talks. Kindly note that during this session, you will not be able to switch on your camera or unmute your mic. To ask questions during the talk, go to the audience chat, type your question, and select Post your question. If your question has not been answered during the talk, you will be notified once it's been answered, or if your question has not been answered during the talk, you can go to www.nebula.com and spin a quest, and your questions will be answered. Thank you for joining us today. We hope this talk broadens your horizons and takes you to new learning heights. We are discussing useful vocabulary that you can use for the IELTS exam, specifically the writing section, and even more specific, task 1. Okay, so let's just get into a general overview about the writing section. So first of all, the writing section is where you have to write 2 tasks within the hour. Now you're presented with 2 tasks. You have task 1, where you have to write a summary of at least 150 words about some visual information. So this visual information will be presented in terms of a graph, a pie chart, line graph, sort of any kind of bar or chart or any kind of visual representation where you'll have to write a summary of it. Okay, now task 2 is where you are presented with a point of view, an argument or a problem, and you'll have to write an essay in response to that. Okay, so again, you have 1 hour to complete these 2 tasks. Okay. Now we're going to look at the different question types that you can get in task 1. Now we'll briefly run through these. Okay, there are various question types that you could get. Now you'll get 1 out of these question types that we're going to look at. So very quickly, on the left we have a bar graph, on the right we have a line graph. So these are exact questions that are from the question papers, so you can just take a minute to read through. Just for the example, I'll just read through one of them. Okay, so let's just look at the bar graph, where it says the chart below shows the total number of minutes in billions of telephone calls in the UK divided into 3 categories from 1995 to 2002. Okay, so the question is, summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. All right, so the kind of questions will be the same in terms of the first sentence will just give you a definition or information about the graph, what it shows. And the second part of the question is what you have to do, which is always summarizing. All right, so the second part, summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. That will always be the same. The sentence above will just be a little different, describing the kind of graph you see. All right, so these are 2. Next, we'll have probably sometimes you'll get a table or you can get a pie chart, which you'll have to compare. Okay, you also could get a process diagram or a map. All right, so you'll have to compare that. And last but not least, you might get multiple graphs. So you might get, in this, we have a pie chart and a table. You could get a line graph and a bar chart. That's what it means by multiple graphs. Okay, so it's really important to understand the different question types that could come up in the exam. Now, since we're speaking about the writing section and specifically task 1, it's really important to understand the question types that come up so that you can practice it and prepare for it and make sure that on the day of the exam, you're not surprised as to if you were only practicing about bar charts and summarizing those and suddenly you get a pie chart and you're like, oh no, I haven't practiced that. It'll become a surprise and it'll add more stress, right? So what happens is task 1, like we discussed, isn't the only task that you have in the writing section. So you definitely just need to spend 20 minutes on it and then move on to task number 2, which would take you around 40 minutes. Task 2 is worth more marks than task 1, but that does not mean you don't spend enough time on task 1. Okay, so make sure that you understand the different question types and you're ready to go. Okay, all right. Now, since we're discussing important and useful vocabulary that you can use for task one. Sorry. We need to understand the importance of vocabulary in the IELTS. Okay, so first things first, we need to remember that the IELTS is fundamentally an English test. All right, it's just a test of your English. So definitely vocab comes into play when you're doing this exam, especially for the writing, also the speaking, but mainly since we're talking about writing, in the writing. All right, so let's just look at what we have here. Vocabulary is very important because it's part of your lexical resource criteria. All right, so just quickly going through the assessment criteria for the writing exam, you'll be scored on 4 criteria, which is task response and or task achievement. So for task 1, it's task achievement. Then you have lexical resource, you have grammatical range and accuracy, and you have coherence and cohesion. Now, as I said before, lexical resource is one of the criteria that you're being marked on. And as we can see, it covers up to 25% of the total score in your IELTS writing section. Okay, so it's 25% of it. A quarter of your marks come from lexical resource, so that's why vocabulary is quite important because it comes under that category. Okay, so again, this criteria is used in 2 sections of the IELTS. It is the writing and the speaking section. Okay, so it's quite important. And also, the wider the range of vocabulary expression used correctly and appropriately, the better your score. Okay, so vocab is very, very important. So it's something that you need to brush up on, make sure that you know and you understand different vocab and different words and different phrases so that you can use them appropriately. Okay? All right. So in terms of what lexical resource is, specifically in the writing section, we have a definition on screen which we can just look at and I'll read aloud. The ability to use a wide range of vocabulary correctly without errors, that means, and appropriately in proper context in your written responses. Okay, so in the brackets, it's very important to understand that you have to use the vocabulary correctly and in the proper context. Now, what happens is sometimes we learn a whole bunch of words and phrases which may seem a little general and generic that we feel like, okay, we can put it in our writing essay, but when we get down to it, it may not actually fit. It might not make sense. All right, so that's why it's a little tricky to learn set phrases and learn set vocabulary. But once you've practiced and prepared enough and you feel like you can have a set of these words or phrases because you'll know that you're using it correctly. Okay? All right. So let's look at how you can demonstrate your lexical resource range. All right, there are a couple of points here which I'm just going to run you through. First of all, using correct synonyms. All right, that's a great way to show your lexical range. Now, what do we mean by using correct synonyms? So if you want to say one thing, first of all, we'll just go through it. What happens is usually in the introductory paragraph that you have for task 1, you have to write, you kind of have to summarize, but you have to paraphrase it. So you don't take words from the question itself, you paraphrase it. So there, in order to paraphrase, you'll need to use synonyms, and that too correctly. So you'll probably have to replace the word, for example, and we'll go through this as we go on in this session. For example, we saw before, the question says, the graph shows. Okay, the first sentence is the graph shows, etc., etc. Now, if you use a correct synonym to boost your score, you could say something like, the graph illustrates, right? Instead of saying shows, we're using the word illustrates, and it kind of sounds a bit more upscale. All right, so that's one example. So using the correct synonyms is one way to demonstrate your lexical resource range. Second of all, using a range of vocabulary. Now, again, here we just discussed learning a couple of set phrases and a couple of words. If you use a range of vocabulary, you will definitely increase your lexical resource score. Okay? But again, the tricky part here is that you need to know that the words you're using are correct and appropriately used. All right? Next up, not repeating words and phrases from the exam question. That's what we just discussed in the first point, and we can do that by using synonyms, because what happens is if the examiner keeps saying repeat words, you might say something when you're describing the graph like there was a rise in, or there was a rise in here, and there was a rise in there. The word rise itself is popping up way too many times in the paper, so the examiner will catch that and say, okay, there's not so much of a lexical resource range here that you're demonstrating, so you might be marked down. All right, so make sure that you don't repeat words and phrases, not only from the exam question, but in general. Okay, next up, using less common vocabulary. Now, there will be some words like we just talked about that will upscale your essay. All right, and those words will stand out to the examiner. Now, again, the tricky part is always making sure that you use this less common vocabulary correctly. All right. Next, not using the same word more than once or one or two times, like we just discussed, not only taking the words from the question, but also repeating words again and again, like we just had the example rise. Okay, so make sure that you know how to say things differently. And last but not least, using precise and accurate words in a sentence. So make sure, again, cannot stress this enough, make sure the words that you're using and the sentences and the phrases that you're using are precise and accurately used. Precisely and accurately used in the sentence, okay? You need to make sure that they make sense, but you also need to make it sound natural, okay? So make sure that, again, the set phrases, if you're learning them, that's fine, but make sure they work in the specific situation. If it doesn't work, feel free to exclude it from your answer. All right. Okay, let's go on to learning some useful vocabulary for the writing section, task one. Okay, so we have vocabulary for the introduction. All right, so as we can see below, task one's introduction should include the following, which is an overview and a description of the general trend. All right, so let's just go into that. Basically, the structure that you can follow is you can begin with the, pretty simple. You don't need to start with anything else. And then you can go on to describe the type of data. So you can say the diagram, the figure, the illustration, any other way of saying what's already there in the question. Now, most of the time they'll say the chart or the graph shows, right? So you can change that by saying the diagram or the figure or the illustration, etc. All right. So after you've written that, you need the verb, okay, and it's something like shows or depicts or represents or illustrates, like we talked about, outlines, denotes. That's fine. That's all saying something that's not in the question. Now, shows is kind of in the question, so you can change it by saying something else. Okay, and then finally add the description. So you can say something like the comparison of, or the differences between, the changes in, the number of. Okay, you're saying what the graph is describing or what the visual representation is describing. Okay, so basically you have formed your sentence. All right, the diagram. So let's just make one, for example. The diagram illustrates the comparison of expenditures between male and female from the years 1992 to 2005. All right, so that's a different way of saying it. Okay, now after that, you have the overview, okay, which generally comes after the introduction. Now, the overview can be included in your introductory paragraph, or it can be the next one after that. All right, so ideally for task one, you're aiming for maybe 3 to 4 paragraphs, depending on where you put your overview, all right, and how you present your what you've depicted from the graph. All right, so here's some vocabulary for the overview. And now overview, as the word suggests, it's just a general, let's say, quick summary of the whole thing. So here's some vocabulary to describe that. You can say in general or generally speaking or overall. Here's a good one. It is observed that, or as can be seen. Okay, those kind of set words or phrases will kind of bring your score a little higher. And as soon as the examiner sees that, he'll be like a tick for you. Okay, so let's put both of them together, the introduction and the overview. So it could look something like this. The diagram illustrates employment rates among adults in 4 European countries from 1925 to 1985. In general, the employment opportunities increased till 1970 and then declined throughout the next decade. Okay, there's a lot of good vocabulary in there. All right, so we can see that we used the diagram illustrates, diagram, okay, illustrates. All right, and maybe the question was phrased differently, so we've kind of paraphrased it and used synonyms, sorry. And also we've used for the overview in general, and our views on that, what we can see from that. All right. And throughout the next decade, instead of saying throughout 10 years, we said in the next decade. Okay. Just give me a moment. All right. Now let's go on to looking at vocabulary for your opening sentence. Okay. So again, after the introduction, you should have your upcoming paragraphs. So these paragraphs should include the main features in details, comparisons and contrasts of the idea, and the most striking features of the graph. Okay, so here are some vocab for your opening sentence. I'm just going to read through a few of them. As it is presented in the diagram or diagrams, if you have multiple, graph or graphs, pie chart or pie charts, table, okay? As it is shown in the illustration, as it can be seen in the dot, 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 okay? I'll just give you a moment to read through that. Okay, and then we have according to or turning to the details. These are all different ways of how you can introduce the main features or how you can compare it. Okay, so it is clear from the data that, and then you say your deduction from that. Okay, so all this vocabulary, again, you don't have to memorize these. These are just some that can help you elevate your essay a bit more. Okay, again, they have to work for the different type of question that you're going to get, but as a starting sentence, these should be fine. Okay, so when you're reporting details, now in these two paragraphs that you have after your introduction and overview and general point, you're going on to the reporting details. Okay, so here's some vocab that you can use if you're trying to describe or show changes. Okay, now a lot of the times it's very evident that in the graphs or in the charts or anything, you will have something that you will have to describe to show the change. So as we saw in the example, it was between a duration, a year duration, right? So if you see that something is increasing, decreasing, or it's staying steady, that's called the trend. Okay, so here are some words that you can use to help. Now I've divided this into verbs and nouns. So accordingly, you have to write the sentence accordingly. So it's really important to understand sentence structuring. So if you're trying to say there was a rise in, you would say that, okay? Or it rose from. Now make sure your tenses are correct. Make sure the word is right. So if you want to show increase, instead of using the word increase, you can say a rise in, okay, an increase in, but that's a little general. So we can say something better, like maybe a climb in, or it's soar, or it shot up, or improved. All right, there was an upward trend. Okay, a growth in, an improvement. Okay, all these words can is a different way of showing how it increased. Okay, now let's look at decrease. Instead of just saying decreasing, maybe just saying fall, a decline, a dip in, a drop in, right? All that sounds a little, it's not, it has a nice ring when you're reading it as well as when you're thinking about it. So that's what we say using synonyms. Okay, and then if you want to show that just a steady change, or there was just steady, it was just steady, you can say unchanged, remain constant. That's a good one that you can use. It remained constant throughout the years 1994 to 1995 or 1996, right? It remained steady, it remained same, it remained stable, right? Okay, so all these are different vocab that you can use to describe or show changes. And it's quite useful because generally when you're describing the graph, the first thing that you pick out usually is the change, right? We can see the graph going up, down, or the bar charts in different heights, right? So here's some good vocabulary for that. Okay, some more vocabulary for reporting details when you're talking about dates, months, and or years. Okay, so you can say from this to this. So from 1992 to 1995, or between 1992 and 1995, or after 2000, right? So from blank to blank, or between blank and blank, is a good way of showing that. Okay, you can also say by 2010 if you have years. Okay, I'm just giving random numbers here, but you can say by this year maybe it had increased or it remained constant, those kind of vocab you can use. Or if it's months, you can say months. So in January it was this, by December it was this. Okay, play around with the words, make sure it makes sense. Or over the period of the certain time period, or during the period of, you can also use that. Another one, you can say that sometimes you'll get questions where it's in the 10-year span. So you can say in the first half of the year. So where you're looking at the first 5 years, right? If it's the span of 10 years, or in the first 3 years, if you're looking, if there's a change in that, you can say in the first half of the year. Okay, but first half, 6 months, it depends on the time. Okay, or for the first quarter, okay, or in the last quarter of the year, or during the first decade. All these words, when you hear me say it or when you say it to yourself, it really does have a nice ring to it. And when you see it on paper, it just kind of stands out to the examiner. So, very useful to use this when you're describing dates, months, or years. Again, you can say in the 80s or in the 1980s if you have a year time frame of 80s. Okay. And then during the next so and so number of months, or the previous year or following year, you can say. Following year is a brilliant thing to say when you're saying something like, when you're describing a certain year, like maybe let's say 1993, and you want to go on to describe 1994 and the years after that. The following year or the following years, you can say, and it really helps. It really elevates your essay. All right. And then another one is within the span of 10 years or within 5 years. So, for example, within the span of 10 years, the values were stable or stayed steady. Okay. Or within 5 years, there was a massive increase or gradual increase or something like that, you can say. And then using words like since, then, and from. That also will kind of help you connect your sentences and connect your points together. All right. Some more vocabulary for reporting details are words and or phrases of approximation. Okay, when you're using words and phrases of approximation. So approximately, nearly, roughly, almost, about, around, more or less, just over, just under, just below, a little more than, a little less than. Okay, all these words, when you're describing something of approximity, these words will really help. All right, so they will just really give that boost to your essay and boost your score a bit too. Okay, so here are just some tips to improve your writing score. Okay, first of all, you need to understand the task. So, what I usually tell all students is that read the question first, understand what's being asked of you, have a look at, let's say, since we're focusing on task one, look at the question, look at what's being presented, identify the type of information that's being presented to you. Is it a pie chart? Is it a bar graph? Is it a line graph? Okay, understand what the task is. And there is no harm in underlining the question or parts of the question. Okay, you can definitely do that if it's paper based. If it's computer based, also, you can just highlight it. There's an option for that. So make sure you understand the task, because then only after that you can write your answer or prepare things to write your answers. Second of all, use your time wisely. Okay, use your time wisely. Make sure that you spend enough time planning and preparing your essay. Make notes. I would always suggest that you take at least 5 minutes to plan out your essay or plan out your task. Okay, make sure that you know the flow, make sure that you know what you're doing, the points that you want to talk about. Okay, because again, especially in task one, you only have dedicated like 15 to 20 minutes to write this. Okay, so you don't want to spend so much time planning, and you don't want to spend so much time writing the answer because you have another task after that. So make sure to use your time wisely. Spend that 5 minutes just to go through the question and plan your essay. All right, that brings us to the next one, which is know your approach. Again, planning comes into that. Know how you're going to attack or attempt the question. Okay, so maybe you have the graphs, you want to pick out certain things, write down those certain things, and make sure that you have enough explanation to support it. All right, so know your approach, know how you're going to get to the question. And last but not least, check your work. Okay, make sure that you're always checking your work, not only for task one, but for all task two as well, the whole writing section. Okay, make sure that you're checking your work. Make sure that you have all your points there. Make sure your spelling is correct. Make sure that you haven't missed any kind of articles. There are a lot of times where students sometimes forget even the single word the or a or something like that, which is very, very important. So make sure again you do your spell check, your other checks. Make sure that you also hit the word limit. Now again, you will have 150 words. That's the minimum. Okay, you can go over, but try and hit that 150 word count. Okay, so make sure you've done all that, and again, make sure you've answered the question. All right, so all this is very important to improve your writing score. Now, to improve your vocabulary, what I usually suggest is that if you see any words or phrases that stand out to you that you don't understand, look it up. Go ahead and look it up. Keep a journal. Write down all these words that you're learning, and also have a note of it. And then another step that I ask students to take is that go ahead and learn the synonyms, learn the words that are similar to that word or that mean the same thing. So that will help you. All right. So by the end of it, you have a book full of vocabulary that you can use. Now, again, I will stress again that whatever words and phrases that you are learning and decide to use, make sure that they are used correctly, and make sure that it's something a bit generic and a bit general, that it's not something specific to one type of question. Okay, so make sure that you're using that correctly, and I'm sure that if you follow all these tips as well as work on your vocabulary, you'll be able to score really well in the writing section. All right, we've come to the end of today's session on useful vocabulary for IELTS Writing Task 1. Thank you so much for joining me today. Do join in for the next Nebula talks that are coming up, not only with the IELTS, but also with various students that we have about different scholarship programs and things like that. If that's something that interests you, do join in. All right. And if you have any questions regarding the IELTS, you can contact me through nebula.com. I am readily available over there. You can just start a conversation with me. I also have different skylifts and Nebula talks and personal guidance sessions for the IELTS, so feel free to look around. Have a look at Nebula website, look under IELTS preparation, and you'll be able to find that there. Thank you so much for joining. I'll see you next time.